Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbeville. It was December of 1944 and America's involvement in World War II was in its fourth winter. Rewind 7 months. Teenager Frank Kocman Jr. had just graduated from Stephen F. Austin High School and Uncle Sam was already calling. In fact, Frank needed a student deferment just to finish high school. By July, 18-year-old Frank Kocman was drafted and was on his way to Fort Sam and on to what was then called Camp Hood. Thought he was being trained to fight the Japanese in the South Pacific, but that all changed. Germany had become even more of a hot spot. Hitler was planning a winter push through Europe that would result in the Battle of the Bulge. Private Frank Kocman's infantry unit was needed in the European theater. It was a fast track from high school to the front lines of the war. Frank Kocman, welcome. It's a pleasure to visit with you on Veterans of the Valley. You're 18 years old, you're just barely out of high school, and 8 months later, you're amid 30-foot snowdrifts in France,
Yes.
and you're fighting a war. That had to be quite an impression on a young man.
Well, it certainly was. It was a big change for me, especially the snow drifts that were 25 and 30 feet deep, because coming from central Texas here, 1 or 2 inches of snow rarely in a period of time. 1 inch compared to 25 or 30 feet is a big change. You're right.
Indeed. You're talk about going over there. We had visited earlier, and they said that you said that the Army was pretty cognizant of your shots and getting over there and making sure that you were healthy once you got there, right?
Well, that's right. Yes. On December the 21st, when we were assembled in a theater where the post commander was giving us the news about the Battle of the Bulge ongoing in Germany at that time, he told us that we would be receiving shots at each of our stops throughout our travels to Europe. And that commander was exactly right about that, because I think we had 8 stops and we had about 12 or 15 shots, immunization shots given to us at each one of those places. The Army did an outstanding job of scheduling and coordinating those shots.
Indeed. You're over there for about 3 weeks, and then talk about what happened then. You're sort of traded off under British command. Is that right, your unit?
Yeah, the unit that I was in, the 79th Infantry Division, we were in Alsace at that time. That was my first venture into combat. We were traded to the British 21st Army Group up in the northern part of Luxembourg and Belgium and Holland, and that was quite an experience, because that was a different command. It had a different structure and all. And you may want me to tell about having to sleep on rooftops.
Yeah, there was dams had been destroyed, and there was flooding. Yeah,
that's correct.
Yeah, that wasn't much fun, especially in that temperature, right?
Well, that's right. It was real cold. There was water for as far as the eye could see, and you don't have any place to sleep except in tree trunks or chimneys on rooftops, or in my case, I slept on top of a canvas deuce-and-a-half truck. And periodically I'd scoop the water off the canvas, because the canvas held the water. But that was quite an experience.
I want to show people what the young Frank Kocman looked like. I think we've got a photograph right now of you that we're going to show up here. There you are.
Oh, gee.
Young, good-looking soldier there. So how old would you have been in that photograph? Just about?
Well, I'm sure that I was 19 years old.
You were young and naive and probably had no idea what you were getting into. Is that right?
I had no idea. Just coming from Brazos County, a small community, not having been associated with a lot of people, and getting into the Army, and then being over there, seeing new countryside for the first time ever in my life. I didn't even dream of that when I was in high school.
Indeed. Talk a little bit about the resistance. I know that you did not fight actually in the Battle of the Bulge itself, but by the time that it was over, the Germans were starting to regroup, and they were flanking the units that you were involved in. Talk a little bit about that and the resistance that you found.
All right. Yeah, the Battle of the Bulge had pretty well been resolved up in Belgium and Luxembourg by the time I got there on January the 17th. But the Germans had regrouped and had hit the American lines in the 7th Army area south in the southern part of France. Actually, it was in the eastern part of France in the Alsace-Lorraine area. And this is part of the foothills of the Swiss Alps. And that's where the mountains were, and that's where all of the snow was, and that's where I was at. The unit that I had been assigned to had fairly severe losses occurred just a few days before I got there. And we were supposedly in secondary defense, but secondary defense means that you're now subject to artillery and mortar fire as opposed to small arms. So our company was given, or battalion I guess, was given the directive to move down into the flatlands near the banks of the Rhine River. And that's an infantry advance. And so that's where we went. And I can remember one of my squad sergeants telling me that he did all the thinking. I was only to take care of my front 25 yards to the left, 25 to the right, straight ahead. He does all the thinking. So I was put in my place pretty quick.
Indeed. You talked about crossing the Rhine River, that this was quite a dangerous thing, especially you were weighted down because that was part of your job. Talk about that and the dangers involved in that.
Okay. I'd be happy to do that. We moved from Alsace up to Holland to train for the Rhine River crossing in late March of '45. And at that time I was the company runner, which meant that I hauled messages from the company commander to the platoon leader or vice versa. And but when we crossed the Rhine River, one of the things that the organization was such that the runner carried the spare batteries for an SCR 300 backpack radio, along with 2 or 3 rounds of bazooka, 3.5 rocket launcher, 4 or 5 bandoliers of 45 caliber ammunition, 3 days worth of K rations that we put in the various big cargo pockets that were on the uniform. So I think I had about 45 to 50 pounds of extra weight when we crossed the Rhine River.
Wow.
This was, I was not in the assault wave. I was in the second wave, following the assault wave by about 20 minutes. Fortunately, we did not meet any resistance, but had a mortar round or artillery round landed close to the boat that we were in, it could have capsized that boat. And there was no doubt that I was not going, no one else in that boat would have survived with that kind of weight.
And actually, you did lose comrades.
We actually did.
Comrades that fell over who were weighted down that just could not survive that.
That's correct. We had probably 24 losses, I think. But got on the far bank, that's the east bank of the Rhine River, and in one particular action, the radio man and the forward observer and the platoon leader were, and myself, I was a few yards away. An large artillery round came in and exploded, and it put the radio man out of commission. And the executive officer, the company executive officer, came up, hollered for me to come up, said, "You still have those batteries, the spare batteries for that radio?" I responded that I did. He said, "Well, grab that radio and come with me. You're now the company radio man." And I can remember that very vividly.
Rapid advancement.
That's right. And I met this the executive officer here in Bryan at one time in 1948 because he was working for Mutual of Omaha at that time.
It is a small world when you talk about that. And referring to that, I believe that the commander of your unit, actually before you got there, was a colonel named Olin Tiger Teague, who you later would become friends with here in Bryan, right?
That is absolutely correct. Colonel Teague was a real good personal friend. We became friends after I'd gotten back because I did not know him when we were in Alsace.
Talk about you're on a Jeep and you're crossing a bridge and you have an encounter with a German tank. It's a pretty scary deal.
Yes, it was.
Talk about that.
Well, have to do a little graphics on it, maybe.
You can describe it. You're sitting on the back of a Jeep, right?
Well, we're crossing a bridge somewhat similar to one of the overpasses on, say, Earl Rudder Parkway over here, and artillery shells, enemy artillery shells, are coming in just in front of us. I'm sitting on the edge, on the corner of this Jeep, with this radio on my back, catching a ride. You know, the company's only had 2 Jeeps, one for the commander and one for the supply sergeant. And I was on the commander's Jeep and sitting on the corner of it. And so the company commander driver, when the artillery shells started landing in front and started hitting the bridge railing and cratering that, he shoved the gears into reverse on the Jeep and backed off that bridge at a high rate of speed. He stopped. When he started up again, I had lost my balance, and he left me sliding across the part of the tarmac, I guess. It wasn't tarmac, it was asphalt.
Right.
So consequently, I had tore my uniforms on the elbows and the knees as I slid this 12 to 15 feet across the asphalt. Well, lost my helmet. He had pulled out, I guess the company commander directed that he get out and go pick me up because he needed his radio and it was strapped to my back.
And they wanted to take you out of service because of your injuries, but that's just something you just did not want to do.
You did not want to do that, that's right. You wanted to stay with the people that you knew, you trusted, you had a relationship with, and if they said they'd be there, they'd be there. This is the kind of comradeship that is built in these units.
After the war, VE Day, talk about that day. Where were you, and talk about the celebration?
Okay, we stopped in a place in northern Germany named, the city was Dortmund, Germany. It had a population of over 500,000, large industrial complex. We were bivouacked on a German airfield, either in pup tents or in some of the hangars or in some of the administrative buildings on that air base. Well, being under British control, their fraternization rule was somewhat more lax than it was in the American sector. And so we were allowed to give civilians, whether they be displaced persons from Estonia or Lithuania or Russia or Finland or wherever, Holland, France, even Germans. So we were allowed to bring them on this area where we were bivouacking for a large celebration to occur the next day, May the 8th, 1945. And my sergeant directed that I give him my coupon, good for admission of someone from the outside. Of course, most of them were female. Mm-hmm. The woman that eventually became my wife, she came that day on May the 8th, primarily because I think she had some desire to have her first American hamburger that our cooks were cooking for the people that were on that post. Uh-huh. So a lot of the newsreels that were there taped a lot of people celebrating VE Day, but a lot of those people that were celebrating VE Day were also Germans.
Right.
And my future wife happened to be one of those.
Right. They were just as happy that the war was over as were the Allies, certainly on that. The war in Europe was over.
That's correct.
And then that's the next point. The war in Europe is over, but the war in Japan is still being fought. And I guess at that time there were thoughts that there might be a ground war in Japan. That obviously all changed with the dropping of the bomb. But after VE Day, you were being trained actually to go over and fight the Japanese, right? But then that all changed. Sort of talk about what happened after VE Day for you.
Well, you're exactly right. The particular division that I was in, the 79th, they were transferring a lot of low point load redeployment point men to that division because they were going to send it to the China-Burma-India theater. And I only had 38 points, so I was a resident of that division. And we were training up until the point that August 4th or 5th, whenever it was, that the atomic bomb was dropped. And at that time, well, all the training then ceased. And all of the low point men, lower than I think about 55, we were transferred to the Big Red 1 as Army of Occupation to serve as Army of Occupation duty. Whereas the other men that remained in the 79th, they came back to the States for ultimate discharge. But as I was telling you earlier, with the Big Red 1, I had gone to that division and was serving it as in and around Nuremberg, Germany, where the war crimes trials were taking place.
Right.
And my duties there, the Army had sent me to a school to learn to climb light poles or wooden poles, telephone poles. And we went into we started rehabilitating the German civilian telephone systems. Some of the work that I did was where you may go along the railroad tracks here and see telephone poles with 5 cross arms and 10 wires on each one of them. Well, that was part of my job, was to reconstruct those and make them serviceable again for the American military as well as the civilian population over there. Reconstruct that country for the communications effort. Mm-hmm. And that's going to lead into something else, I'm quite sure.
Indeed. That gave you a pretty good little bleep on your resume that would serve you well when you got back home.
That's correct.
That's right. We'll get to that in a minute.
All
but
right.
A couple of things, we'll backtrack a little bit. Talk
Okay.
about the Lucky Medal.
Okay. When I came home at Christmas 1944, I'd had a 5-day delay en route that began on December the 21st of 44. By the time I got home, 2 days of that 5 days had already been used in getting home. And so my folks, my family, had a great big celebration on Christmas Day with a lot of my uncles and aunts and cousins, and it was at my mother and father's home. And one of my uncles who had served in World War I in the Meuse-Argonne forest, who had been wounded there, he had a little religious icon picture, and he had whittled it out while he was in the hospital recovering from a wound that he had received in World War I. He took a little religious picture and placed it inside of a oval-shaped mirror that came in a Cracker Jack box. He fished the mirror out, cleaned the silvering off of the back of the mirror, and installed that religious icon in there, and then put the glass back there. And so this was a focal point for him. And our religion believes in that you pray to an icon. You know, you pray. It's a focal point. Not you don't pray to the icon, but anyhow. So that protected him in World War I. On Christmas Day, 1944, he gave me that medal, and talked about his experiences in World War I. I carried that medal to Germany, to Europe, with me, and brought it back. I suffered nothing from it. I was never wounded. I never, outside of those scrapes falling off that Jeep, came back in good shape. In 1950, he gave that. Before 1950, I gave that medal back to him, my uncle. In 1950, he gave it to his son, who went to Korea and served in the Korean conflict. He came back unscathed. In 1964, I believe it was, my uncle gave that very same icon back to his grandson, who was a gunner on a helicopter gunship in Vietnam. And this young man came back unscathed as well. And a few years ago, I asked this grandson if I could borrow that metal because I wanted to write some of the autobiographies of biographies of some of the people that carry that metal. That metal has quite a history to it, and I have it in my possession now, and I need to finish that project.
Indeed. I'm sure it's a metal that doesn't get very far away from you.
No, it doesn't. I've got it. As a matter of fact, I have it secured in a lock place in my house with my wife's jewelry. Don't want to advertise where that's at, of course.
Exactly where it should be, of course. I want to backtrack to another story.
Okay.
Very good story. December 7th, 1941, obviously the day that does live in infamy. You were a 15-year-old Boy Scout.
That's
Talk
correct.
about what happened that day and what the young, naive Frank Kocman thought about that day.
Well, I'll tell you what. I can tell you what I thought about it, but everyone that was with me thought the same thing. We had been out at Camp Aramon, which is north of, it's in
Sure.
eastern Robertson County, north
Right.
of Rhine.
Still there.
And it's still there.
Right.
And we were on our way back from an outing there, and we'd come around through what's now FM 50, and in our steel store. At steel store, we could see a large black plume of smoke coming from the Brazos River. So we drove over there, which is not, it's not a matter of 3 or 4 miles away. Drove over there, and that trestle leading up to the bridge crossing the Brazos River on Highway 21 West was on fire. I'm sure some of our viewers today will no doubt remember that. And of course we started, I don't know whether we started it or whether we heard this, but the rumor was that that bridge had been bombed by the Japanese. We didn't know that the Japanese had actually bombed Pearl Harbor, but someone who had a radio had told us that. So most of the Boy Scouts, all of us really, we surmised that the Japs had bombed that bridge. Now, you can take Brazos County as a target for the Japanese. Well, we can get a chuckle out of that today, can't we?
So the Japanese not only bombed Pearl Harbor, but they also decided to get South Robertson County while they were at it. That's also, right?
That also, incidentally, probably the targets there, if you don't mind my digressing a little bit. Just on the other side in Burleson County was that was called Whiskey Bridge for the adults. And there was quite a large number of, there were several liquor stores there. So that must have been the target for the Japanese, the liquor.
Well, who knows? I mean, Camp Hearn was a German POW camp during the war.
That's right,
so,
it was.
Well,
that happened later.
That happened a little bit. That happened a little bit later too.
Yeah.
We've got a few more minutes.
Okay.
You finally come home,
Yes.
and let's talk about that. Climbing those telephone poles served you well because you came home and got yourself a job out of that deal.
That's correct. I sure did. I went down to apply for some assistance that the Veterans Administration was giving. Actually, it was the Texas Employment Commission. They had a program called 5220. They would help you get a job, pay you $20 a week for up to 52 weeks, or until such time as they found you a job. Well, I went down there and applied for that because I was unemployed. I'd left a job that was a part-time job. And a few days after I applied, I got a letter from the Texas Employment Commission that I was to go for an interview with the local telephone company. I went down there, and they promptly hired me because I had on my resume some experience as climbing telephone poles in Germany. And they just happened to need somebody that could fit that bill. Well, somewhere during the course of that, between the time I interviewed for the job and the time I reported for work, they changed my employment criteria to that of assisting a cable splicer that they had recalled from retirement in 1941. The man's name was Jim Ellis. He had expertise in splicing lead shield cable for the telephone company. And this man, as I recall, did not drive an automobile. He did not know how to drive. So one of my jobs was to chauffeur him to the job site, to hoist his platform, cable splicing platform up to the cable. And two other important criteria was, one was to keep the paraffin hot in a pot on the ground that he was going to subsequently use to boil the water out of the cable, and the other one was to keep his pot of lead hot that he used to seal the sleeve that went over the lead cable. Well, and he said, if you can do that, Frank, you'll be all right. We'll get along together real fine. And so consequently, I gave that job 100% effort. But that job did not pay enough to support a wife and a child that I subsequently had. I had the young lady that I met in Germany come over, and I married her here in Bryan, and we subsequently had a child.
Yeah. So
for 90 cents an hour, I couldn't continue with the telephone companies. And then in May of 1949, I started a career at A&M in the systems building as a bookkeeper.
Indeed. And not only that, people know you very well as also over at Kyle Field, been a ticket taker and head usher for some 50 years. We've only got about a minute left. That's a whole other show. But a lot of people know you as that guy at Kyle Field for 50 years.
That is correct. Statewide, I have many, many friends that look for me when they come to Kyle Field to renew our acquaintance and tell me stories about their families and ask me about mine.
Indeed. Frank Kocman, it's been a pleasure. We could do more and more shows about your service and about your service not only in World War II, but your service right here in the Brazos Valley, and we thank you for being our guest today. Appreciate it, Frank.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Frank Kocman was one of the fortunate soldiers who survived to celebrate VE Day and eventually come home to Bryan and restart that precious youth that had been delayed by war. Many gave their lives to defend our country, and those who didn't gave away some of the best years of their lives. And for that, we should salute and thank them every day. For Frank Kocman, I'm Tom Turbeville. Join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.